Right. So today we have an interesting one, but I still think it'll be fun. We're going to be doing our top 5 favorite directors. A couple things just to get out of the way at the beginning. This is our favorite directors. We're not going to be necessarily debating the best. We'll be talking about the different reasons why we like them. And also, we didn't necessarily give ourselves any sort of parameters like we have done with lists in the past. This was pretty much just, a free for all, really. Who are your favorites? And we'll just be going through a little bit of a discussion. So, no parameters or anything like that. And with that, I'll go ahead and throw it over to you.
All right. So to start off, well, as we normally do with an honorable mention, I went with a guy who I've talked about quite a bit throughout the podcasts, referencing movies that he's directed and or written. But for my honorable mention, I went with Lee Winnell. And really, the main reason he's at an honorable mention for me is because A, he's only technically directed 3 movies, and B, these movies have all been relatively recent. So just because um, he hasn't had a numerous filmography, and it's relatively short and relatively recent. I didn't feel confident that I could, had as much material to go on to put him higher on. But I am a huge fan of Lee Winnell. I am cheating a little bit in sort of like including his writing, directing sort of together with him as one creative figure. But obviously, I've talked about Upgrade being one of my favorite movies from 2018. Good, gritty sci-fi dystopian thriller original too, which is something I'm going to talk about with Lee Winnell. The Invisible Man from 2020. Absolutely love that movie. It's a 5 out of 5 for me. One of my favorite horror movies of the 2020s so far. One of my favorite movies of the 2020s so far. And it was my favorite horror movie from 2020 when we did that list. But obviously, most people also know him from his writing before he was a director, writing, Saw, Dead Silence, some of the Insidious movies. His directorial debut was Insidious Chapter 3, which I'd say is easily in last place of his filmography, but is still decent. But yeah, what I love about Lee Winnell, and I think we see this the most in Upgrade, is in Upgrade, he brings out just a very kinetic and dynamic um, visual style. I think when it comes to a director as opposed to a writer, I'm looking for that sort of like visual flair. How are they moving the camera? How are they positioning shots? And I think Upgrade really excels at just really creative camera work with the action scenes. It feels very like kinetic and dynamic. And then in The Invisible Man, I think that he just did a masterful job at just generating tension. Just the way that he would frame things, where he would put I guess you could say, the visible characters sort of off center. So it almost like leaves room in the screen for like that invisible presence. So it makes you really feel like the Invisible Man really is there when you can't see him, even doing things such as just like zooming in on a chair that's empty, but just building this sense of dread that, is there someone there? Is there not? That sort of paranoia that came with the film. So I just think he just does amazing work. And at least for a director, that's one of the main things that I'm looking for, how they're crafting, this narrative visually on the screen with putting the elements in places. But and obviously with his writing career, like I alluded to, I think how I mentioned with Upgrade, it was original. I think Invisible Man, despite being a readaptation, I guess you could say, feels very original because it's really nothing like, other than the same general premise of there being like an Invisible Man, is very different from either the book or the Universal movies, the previous Universal movies. So I just think overall he also just excels at telling very original stories, and working in that sort of like perfect low to mid budget range. That's not these big overblown CGI blockbusters, but these smaller, more original stories, is where I think that he excels. So definitely could be one of my favorite directors of all time and actually make a top 5 list. Once he starts making more films and they consistently hit, he's definitely on a good trajectory for that. But just because he's only technically directed 3 films and they've all been relatively recent, I just decided to put him as an honorable mention.
Yeah, solid pick. As you know, I'm not as high on him specifically because of the Invisible Man. I know we kind of differ on that movie, but of course, huge Saw guy, so he holds a special place in my heart. It is actually interesting that you started with this because so at the beginning I mentioned there were no parameters, but in order to craft this list, I kind of had to define how I would go through making my top five favorite directors. And as you know, and the longtime listeners have probably been able to gather, generally speaking, my favorite movies happen to be movies that fly under the radar and are created by people who have done like one, maybe two movies. And so to me, that didn't work for this list. I had to try and pick directors that have a big enough filmography that I could really dissect their style and enjoy a large amount of their work to then be placed on this list. So a lot of the people that you may have expected would not be on here, if they've only done a couple things. So it's interesting that you started with one who only has done three things. Like you said, of course, he's had his hand in the cookie jar on others, but as far as actual directing. Also, it's okay that you cheated because I can tell you right now, two of the people on my list, I also cheated because uh, for me personally, I know that generally speaking with Hollywood, there's probably a different writer and director when a movie is made, but I personally put a lot more stake in when a person does both. So normally a lot of my favorite directors also are writing and they're truly making their vision come to life. I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. If you have more of those on your list, I'm completely welcoming it. A lot of the points I'm going to make about my specific directors also have to do with their writing style and, like I said, how they create their vision. And so, I'm perfectly fine with you cheating. um, but yeah, so this is an interesting list. I have four honorable mentions that I'm just kind of gonna speed run because when I was making this list, I was like, okay, based off of the parameters I just gave myself, who fits, and then I ranked them, and these four just didn't quite make the cut in no specific order. Sam Raimi, kind of like I said, I more or less love the guy because of how he got his start. Of course, when he makes Evil Dead, he's funding it all himself. He didn't even pay any of the actors. Bruce Campbell just took a chance on the man, and of course, it ended up working out for him. And I personally love those stories where it's somebody who has nothing but a car and a dream, and they went into the forest and they made it work. And so, has he done a bunch of movies I love? Not necessarily, but I wholeheartedly respect him for where he started. Then Michael Bay, kind of like you said with Roland Emmerich in our last uh, uh, podcast, he's just a fun guy. Like you can debate whether or not his movies are actually good, but if there's one thing he knows how to do, it's have fun. And as you probably know from listening to the podcast, there are definitely times when I like to just sit down and enjoy a nice big fun movie, and Michael Bay's really good at doing that. Also, I love the reboots that he's produced. I know that that's not him directing, but I'm just going to throw that in there. Then the next one I have here is Matthew Vaughn. We were just talking about this recently. Do I love all of his movies? I love Kick-Ass, but I've never been like the biggest Kingsman person. I feel like those are the two he's most known for. But there's no denying that the dude is masterful at crafting fight sequences. And like everybody found out in our last podcast, I absolutely love martial arts movies. I put a lot of weight into fight sequences in movies. Of course, we have this new renaissance that pretty much started with John Wick, where the modern American film finally adapted to what they've been doing overseas for years, where it's longer cuts, the actors actually doing their shots. It's not like it's Jason Bourne or in Taken, where you can tell that they had to do 16 cuts to allow Liam Neeson to hop over a fence. So I love those long, drawn out scenes where you can tell that they really put a lot of time and effort into making it look good. And then Matthew Vaughn just takes it to another level. Kind of like you were talking about with Lee Winnell, the way that he can angle a camera to where you can just see little things here and there. Like I've rewatched the scene with Colin Firth from that first Kingsman movie where they're in the church a million times, and I always feel like I'm finding something new. He puts so much care into even what the background actors are doing, and so Do I love all of his movies? No, but as when it comes to action sequences, I personally think he's one of the best, if not the best, in the way that he can craft just a beautiful looking sequence. And then my last honor mentions Edgar Wright. The Cornetto trilogy is absolutely awesome. It's hilarious. It's funny. It's directed well. Of course, they're all basically horror comedies, so you know I'm gonna love them. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is one of my personal favorite movies. I recommend it to everybody who hasn't seen it. I know it's like quirky fun, but that's Edgar Wright in a nutshell, and I think that he does Scott Pilgrim good. He does the manga justice. The movie's absolutely amazing. I highly recommend everybody watch it who's listening. And then Baby Driver from 2017. At the time it came out, it was my favorite movie. It pretty much held the title of my favorite movie for a good year or two. It had had a solid run. Once again, just he's good at doing quirky fun. He writes well, and he directs even better. And Baby Driver is proof of that. I think I know I showed it to our mutual friend. I forget if I showed it to you or not, but like I said, at the time, Baby Driver held the number one spot, and so for that movie to be able to do that, that just helps Edgar Wright's case, and his filmography is really good. And also, he is the one who's helming the Running Man remake. So if you listen to a podcast from a couple weeks ago, The Running Man is one of my favorite movies of all time. I'm very excited that he's bringing it back and hopefully puts a nice fresh spin on it, and I'm sure he'll do a good job.
Yeah, well, since you just mentioned Baby Driver, I'll go sort of in reverse order. Yeah, out of Edgar Wright's movies, I've only seen Scott Pilgrim. I've only seen two of his movies actually, but they're both two that I really love. Like you said, Baby Driver. I gave Baby Driver a 5 out of 5. I love that movie. I have since watched that, and that was really great time, and he did an amazing job directing those sequences. And Scott Pilgrim versus the World, I think I was at like a 4.5 out of 5, where it's like a near perfect film for me. And I also love that film. So I haven't actually seen any of the Cornetto trilogy, which is like you'd think I'd at least have seen like Shaun of the Dead, but I have not. And so at least at some point I plan on watching that entire trilogy. Um,
I would be willing to bet that Hot Fuzz will probably be your favorite because I know you're not really big into the whole horror comedy thing, and Hot Fuzz is like the least quirky, but also it's making fun of like the secret society trope in horror movies, and I think that you like that kind of stuff, so I feel like Hot Fuzz is going to be your favorite.
well, I definitely will check those out. Any list that you see though with those at World's End is always the last. It's either people always
Yeah,
go between Hot Fuzz or Shaun of the Dead.
one, I think it came out at a time when actually, I don't want to spoil the twist, but so he picks a different horror trope to make fun of in each one, and I think it came out at a time that it just like if it had come out a few years earlier, he would have been good. But also, it took him a while to make that final movie. There was just a lot of production issues, and it definitely has one of the worst scripts of the three.
World wonders what would have happened if he actually directed Ant-Man.
Was he actually attached to direct Ant-Man before it
But
came out?
yeah, that was a big Marvel thing. He was attached, he wrote a script, he even did test footage, and he was like they were very heavily in pre-production, and then he quit. And so when Peyton Reed stepped in, they basically had to rework it because it was basically like they'd done all the screen tests, they had the costume design, they had concept art, he had a script, like they were getting ready to run. And then there was like creative differences. Apparently he's very difficult to work with because he's a little bit of like a diva.
That doesn't surprise
But
me in the slightest.
but yeah, so that's like one of those big MCU things of like what if because he was like very involved in doing Ant-Man.
Interesting.
Um but yeah, him. Who else did you talk about? Michael Bay, of course, we've talked about. I think him and Roland Emmerich are kind of in the same boat of they're both like guilty pleasure fun. I actually really
Definitely.
like Ambulance. Everyone check out Ambulance. That was one of the most underrated movies of 2022. Sam Raimi. I'm not the biggest fan of the Evil Dead movies. I think I've mentioned that, but his Spider-Man trilogy is always gonna have a special place in my heart.
I
And then
actually didn't point this out, but as you probably know, he had wanted to direct a superhero movie for ages, but no one would give him a chance, so he made his own. He did Dark Man starring Liam Neeson, And as a
Right.
kid, that was my favorite superhero movie. Like it's really well done. You can tell he truly loves superheroes. So even he does well, paying homage to the craft.
Yeah, I even think in I don't know if you ever saw Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness, but I think the parts where you can tell Sam Raimi was able to take the reins, it's great. It's just the many sequences when you can tell that Disney corporate sort of overruled that it suffered. But
Yeah, no, I never did end up seeing it. I heard it was terrible, so I just didn't. I was excited for it because I
there
really liked the first Doctor Strange and of course Sam Raimi, but I never ended up watching it. And the last person I said was Matthew Vaughn.
Right, Matthew Vaughn. I have not seen Kick-Ass yet. I definitely need to slash want to. I am a big fan of Kingsman, at least the first one. The second one was probably one of the most disappointing movies at the time I had seen it, where I had hyped it up so much because I love the first one, and it just did not meet those heights. But I'm very excited for Argyle coming out next year.
Yes. 100% agree. That really helped put him on this list because uh there's not a lot of movies coming out I'm excited for, and Argyle is definitely one of them. Once I saw that he was attached and I saw the cast, I was all in.
Once I saw Dua Lipa was in there, I was sold. My ticket was bought.
Not John Cena.
Not John Cena, unfortunately.
Uh,
Um, but yeah, from the twisted mind of Matthew Vaughn. Yeah. Um, yeah, so no, all solid picks and good honorable mentions. Okay, so my number five is so making this list, it was kind of difficult for me because I tried to balance directors, ranking them based on their style with the movies they direct and how much I like them. But also I wanted directors that I'd seen all or most of their Scorsese that people say are like, oh, the greatest directors of all time. And they might be, but I've only seen maybe
Real
like,
quick,
a
I'm
quarter
not
of their
sure if
movies.
it registered for the recording, but I just lost your audio. Do you mind starting back from when you said I have seen either most or all of their filmography?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. um Picking directors where I'd seen all or most of their filmography because like a Spielberg or a Scorsese, I might like genuinely love some of their movies, but I've only seen maybe like a quarter of their movies because they made so many. So I tried to focus on directors that I'd seen all or most. So for my number five, when I was looking at directors that fit all those criteria, I was kind of surprised, but I did have to put him. Um, I kind of am a little biased here because he's also my maybe not my favorite actor, but one of my top five favorite actors. But I went with Ben Affleck for my number five. So like I said, I love him as an actor, but then I looked at the movies he's actually directed. And one thing I will say is a lot of actors that A are really good at acting, or B, maybe they're fine actors or whatnot. Either way, they try directing or writing and they just absolutely fail. They fall flat on their face. But I feel like Ben Affleck is one of the rare cases where he's a great actor. He's literally an Oscar winning screenwriter, and he didn't technically win an Oscar for Best Director, but he directed Argo, which won Best Picture. So by sort of extension, he directed a Best Picture winner. So combining all these things just makes him probably one of my favorite people in Hollywood today. But as a director, specifically for this list, looking through his filmography, The Town is one of my favorite movies of all time. I think I would probably put The Town in my top 10 favorite movies of all time. It's so random because I historically don't like heist movies or really like organized crime movies, but something about The Town just like completely resonated with me, and I rewatch it. I've rewatched it so many times, and it's one of my go-to, not like a comfort movie, but it's like a go-to. Like if I'm in the mood for like a thriller, it's definitely comes to the forefront of my mind there. I think it got him an Oscar nomination, but I mean, just going through like Gone Baby Gone, a very solid mid 2000s, true crime sort of thriller. I mentioned The Town. Argo is great. I love movies based on a true story. Argo is great. Won Best Picture. I have the one I actually have not seen, Live by Night, is the one that most people say is not not his best. But so maybe that's playing into it a little bit that I haven't seen the one that most people consider his worst. But most recently, he did Air earlier this year, which is one of my favorite movies of the year so far. So I was just looking and just realized how he has just such a solid group of films that I really love and respect him as a director for being able to
Excuse me.
and direct these movies at the same time. And like I said, that's hard for any actor to do, even if they're not starring, but he manages to also have a great performance starring in it. So I just feel like that speaks to his talent. And I feel like with movies like really all of his movies, but like specifically like Air or Gone Baby Gone or The Town. I just think he does really well at telling these very personal stories where it's like people, like regular people that get caught up in these big grand circumstances, but it just keeps it very centered and focused on the people themselves, even when they're in these larger than life situations, like these big things happening to them. And I just think he carries that human element very well. So yeah, I genuinely love a lot of his movies, both acting and directing, and I just think his directing style. He just basically is directed. Granted, I haven't seen what people say, but I think he's just directed nothing but pretty much bangers. So, um, but yeah, and he should have stayed on to direct his own solo Batfleck movie. So, if only, but
It's definitely funny because that's the I feel like of all of the stuff that didn't happen in the DCEU, that's the one I'm the most upset about, especially because they teased us with the Joe Deathstroke, and I feel like him and Batman would have been great, and I'm sure he would have come up with a really good trilogy, and I don't know. That one's probably the one that I'm most upset about that we didn't get. But yeah, so this is an interesting one. I'm going through the list. Never seen Gone Baby Gone. I can't say this on this podcast, but that first short he did, haven't seen that one. Um, The Town, funny story. So I would have been 11 when these trailers were showing, and I vividly remember this movie because I was so scared of the nuns that I never watched this movie. I would I would change the channel when the trailer would come on, and for the longest time, I thought this was a horror movie. So that's just a funny story for you. Nuns creep me out, and so never saw Argo. For the longest time, I thought that he remade Fargo, you know, and
one
ironically,
does.
I am the super duper basketball fan here, and I still haven't seen Air. So I can't really comment on his directing style because I haven't seen any of the movies he's directed, but they all have really funny reasons for why I haven't seen them.
Definitely need to see The Town and Air. I think those are just the two. Gone Baby Gone it's good, but it's not like, it was his directorial debut, so it's nothing like, in my opinion, nothing like special. But The Town and Air I'd put up there as like genuinely great movies.
Okay, I will watch. It's been on my list just because I feel like I'm required to watch all basketball movies ever, so I will watch it eventually. I think it like just came on Prime or something, so I have it on my list. But I will find The Town somewhere, and I'll get past my fear of nuns.
There you go. I believe in you.
Um, so to start off my list, my number five is a recent one. And with this specific person, I happened to see two of his movies, having no idea he's the one who did them. They just came out, the trailers look cool, I watched them, absolutely fell in love, and then decided I was going to go back and kind of I guess I should say I've seen this person do movies for years and never knew he was the one doing them. So when everything came together, I was like, oh, I guess I just happen to like every movie this guy does. And that person is Guy Ritchie. That's my number five. The Gentleman and Wrath of Man were the two more recent movies that I saw that I fell in love with. And then when I normally fall in love with a director, I go back and I watch all of their filmography. I think I've mentioned that before on the podcast. But this one was an easy one because it turns out I had seen both Sherlock Holmes, loved those, loved Man from Uncle, loved King Arthur. I know that one kind of bombed, but I really wish that had like spawned the franchising that it was supposed to because Legend of the Sword's really good. His newest movies are Operation Fortune and The Covenant, which once again both are on my list, but I haven't actually gotten a chance to watch them yet, so I can't speak to those. But this one was just purely an instance of I literally like all the movies he's done, and so I kind of want to put him here. But I have him five because for the four people ahead of him, I can speak to actual things with their directing style that they do. That is why I like them. For Guy Ritchie, it's kind of just I guess you would say the vibes. Like there's not a specific reason why I like them. I just like all of his movies. And I'm not 100% done. I know that Snatch and Lock, Stock, and Smoking Barrel are his two like biggest ones, the ones from like early 2000s. That's like what launched him. So eventually I'll watch those. I'm working my way back, but um, at least since Sherlock Holmes, been releasing nothing but bangers. So yeah, no, I don't have much to say, but number five is Guy Ritchie, purely just for the vibes.
Okay, so I'm looking at his filmography. I've only seen three of his movies. I've seen, so sort of interesting. I've seen both Sherlock Holmes movies, and those are movies where when they first came out, I was like 10 and 12 when they came out, and I like loved them. And I think I rewatched them like several times on like DVD around when they came out, but I don't think I've watched either of them in like 10 years. But I remember watching them a lot just 10 years ago. So I like kind of remember them, but not really. So I'm kind of curious to check them out to see if I still like them. That third one's been in development hell for the longest time. It was one of those cases where Robert Downey Jr. wasn't too busy yet, and then they just hit it off with Avengers, and it made $1 billion, and he was like the hottest commodity in Hollywood, so he just got swept up by the MCU to not finish it.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then I've seen Man from Uncle, and I love Man from Uncle because I love Henry Cavill, and I don't know if he's uncanceled yet for being a cannibal, but I also love Armie Hammer, and um, I just thought they were great, and that definitely could have been like a good franchise, like a sort of middle of the road between like James Bond and Kingsman, where it would like have some comedy, but it wouldn't be like a full on like Kingsman absurd comedy, but like still be like a really good espionage spy thriller. So that could have been a great franchise, but unfortunately, I don't think it did well at the box office. So, but I wanted to see The Covenant from early this year, and I think it's on Amazon Prime. So I think that might be a movie I
It
watch with my
is.
dad because I feel like he'd like it.
Yeah, I can't.
But
That's why
other than
I
that, I
haven't
have
watched
not
it yet.
seen any of his
My
movies.
dad wants to watch it with me.
Right. Yeah, other than that, I have not seen any of his movies.
um, well, I at least recommend The Gentleman and Wrath of Man. I also I guess the one I shouldn't say I like all of his movies because the one I didn't like was the live action Aladdin. I always forget he directed that, but I went ahead and went to IMDb so that way I could follow along with you. And I'm retroactively saying I like all of his movies except for one.
He's
But
doing, I think it's Hercules. He's doing another live action Disney movie.
I
I
know
think
they're
it's
I know he's working
Hercules.
on Aladdin too.
Yeah, he was doing a sequel to Aladdin. I think it's Hercules. I think that's
Okay.
the one he's also going to do. But yeah. Well, like I said, looking at his filmography, like I had said with The Town, how that's the exception. I don't really like crime movies or like organized crime movies, and that kind of looks like 90% of what he does.
Yeah, basically so the gentleman is just a whole bunch of holy crap what's going on with these different crime people, and then Wrath of Man isn't necessarily a crime movie per se. This is not giving anything away because it's in the trailer. Jason Statham is wronged, we'll just say that, and so he's decides to get hired at this I forget the word for it, but you know how there are companies who drive around safes and they go around to like retail stores and whatnot and they'll pick up money and that's how like they do deposits. He works for one of them so that way he can find the crew who wronged him and then he wrongs them. So it's like an action movie with like a crime undertone, but it's really good.
Yeah.
Underrated performance from Josh Hartnett. He is absolutely amazing in that movie. Um, and you'll recognize everybody on the crime team that wrongs him. It's like Jeffrey. Why am I trying to blank in his name? Jeffrey Donovan from Burn Notice. Scott Eastwood. It's just yeah, it's just a good movie.
I'll have to check. I definitely think I'll watch The Covenant. That would be the next one that I'd watch. Um, okay. Guy Ritchie, number 5. My number 4, I would say, I think he's now this director now has earned the spot where it's like every time he puts out a new project or anything, I'm just going to be immediately like sold, like ticket day one. We're starting to enter that territory, but um, for this director, yeah, I just think he's definitely one of the most promising, and I don't want to say promising because he's had a career for a while. One of the most intriguing directors now because he's definitely won me over to me just constantly wanting to know what he's going to do next, and having my full faith and trust in him. But it's Matt Reeves for my number 4. So I'm looking at his filmography, and he made a really random. I've heard people talk about this. A really random like rom com with David Schwimmer in like 1996, but then there was like a 12-year gap. So like, not counting that first one that I haven't seen because I feel like no one's seen it. I mean, just back to back Cloverfield, Let Me In, Dawn, and then War of the Planet of the Apes, and then of course the Batman. Um, I think first of all, my main observation with Matt Reeves is I give him a lot of credit for really pouring into his projects as passion projects. Like you look at his filmography and they're very spaced out. They're like 3, 4, 5 years apart. And to me, that really speaks to a director because it shows that he's selective and that he cares. He's not just doing this for a job. He wants to pick a project and focus on that project, put his heart and soul into it. And I think we saw that most recently with the Batman, but I think it's really something that he's been doing this entire time. Um, for all these movies, especially, like Cloverfield, the Apes movies, and then of course the Batman, I think what he excels at is like making a universe, like making a universe feel filled in and like large. Like maybe small stories, but like he just really contextualizes a universe, really unlike any other director I can think of. Like Cloverfield has that big feel, of course, with like so many allusions to a larger universe out there to sort of take you beyond just this found footage group of people in New York. Of course, the Apes movies coming off of Rise, having the foundation established, he really expanded it and made that filled in that whole universe. And of course, with the Batman, one of my favorite movies of the 2020s easily. It was like my second favorite movie of last year behind Top Gun Maverick. But just an incredibly well filled in universe, like I keep saying with him, because I think he just truly has a cinematic mind to make these movies feel grand. Even like Let Me In, which is probably my least favorite, actually is my least favorite of his movies, I still quite enjoy, and you still see a lot of that Matt Reeves flair. But just overall, it just seems like he's very selective with his projects, and he typically hits home runs with his projects. And now he's like moving into TV with like the Penguin and then all these other Batman spinoffs, and he's sort of spearheading this Battinson Batman pocket universe with HBO and with Max and Warner Brothers, and I'm just really curious for that. But I think he proved, especially with the Batman, that basically I'm there day one for anything he's going to do. And of course, being a huge fan of the Planet of the Apes trilogy, Dawn and War, or Planet of the Apes franchise, Dawn and War. I know he didn't do Rise, but like everyone still calls it the Matt Reeves trilogy, even though he didn't do Rise because he did the second two. But that's probably my favorite movie trilogy of the past at least decade. So yeah, Matt Reeves at my number 4.
Yeah, this one's interesting because I know even we were talking about before when I was younger and I watched all the Planet of the Apes movies when they came out. I really liked Rise, and then I didn't like Dawn and War. I'm gonna toss that up to just the way I was when I was younger, and I know I really need to rewatch this trilogy because I have a feeling that I'll really like it upon rewatch. So I don't want to take anything away from those movies given my current headspace. But what I will say is, of course, I'm on board with the Batman. Um, it's interesting because I feel like, especially when it came out, this was relatively divisive. Like I know when Pattinson was first cast, they were all like, okay, he can't play Batman. What's going on here? And then all the other castings came out and it was like, he's picking the most unconventional people for these roles. But in my personal opinion, like you said, given the world he built, I actually think he did an amazing job of who he cast. All the actors do great. I think his writing's really good. I love his cinematography. I love the Batman world he created. Um, I know I kind of talked about this before, whether you don't like the Batman because it's not true to comics or whatever you want to say, given the world he created and the world he's building, I'm completely on board. I'm very excited for the TV shows. I wish they would come out quicker. But it's kind of like you said, even from the beginning, he said, hey, I'm not going to rush these out. I'm going to take my time on them. This isn't going to be an MCU thing. So I respect it. I just wish that they were out yesterday. So that's
But
really the only one I can comment on.
yeah, for sure. Definitely am very excited for his Batman universe.
Yeah, we need that first Penguin episode tomorrow, right?
Yeah, yesterday. We needed that Penguin pilot yesterday.
So for me, my number four, I know at the beginning I talked about, hey, I'm only gonna pick people who have like really built filmographies, and number four is the person who has the least lengthy, we'll say. But kind of in the same vein of how you just said, whenever Reeves makes a movie, I'm going to be there day one to see it. Same with this guy. And what really helped me drive this home is I saw the trailer for his upcoming movie, The Fall Guy, and it doesn't even necessarily look good, but the minute I saw his name, I was like, butt in seat, take my money. And that is, of course, David Leitch. For those of you who don't know, David Leitch and Chad Stahelski are famous stunt people who decided in 2014 that they were going to partner up with Keanu Reeves and make this little indie flick called John Wick. Little did they know it was going to essentially revolutionize the action industry and spawn into the gigantic franchise that it became. Chad Stahelski stayed on to direct the sequels to John Wick. He hasn't really done anything else, though, of course, given the events of John Wick 4, we're going to get to see what he does. So maybe this could be revisited. But as far as David Leitch is concerned, he broke off to then do, in order, Atomic Blonde, Deadpool 2, Hobbs and Shaw, Bullet Train, and then, of course, The Fall Guy, which is coming out in 2024. This is a complete example of I've liked every movie. Atomic Blonde's the one where when it first came out, I wasn't on board, but then once I rewatched it, now I am. It's kind of been a development hell for a decade now, but there's supposed to be a John Wick Atomic Blonde crossover, and apparently, Charlize Theron's character was secretly a ballerina and like is gonna know John Wick and they're gonna team up. But even Atomic Blonde 2's been in development hell, so I don't know if that's ever gonna happen. But going to the other ones, if I remember correctly, you don't necessarily agree with this, but I think Deadpool 2 is better than the first movie. I absolutely love it. That's the only thing keeping me excited for Deadpool 3 because it sounds like they're not going to Disneyify it. So here we go. I'm a huge fan of the Fast and Furious movies. Everybody who saw Fast 7 and Fast 8 knew that The Rock and Jason Statham had this awesome chemistry, and so it only made sense to do a spin-off, and of course, that's what we get with Hobbs and Shaw. I think it completely loses itself once they go to Samoa for the last like 20-ish minutes of the movie, but that was like a stipulation for The Rock to agree to do it. So since he's The Rock, you got to do what the man says, I guess. But the first like hour and a half, absolutely amazing, hilarious, great action sequences. That's of course he's a stuntman. He knows how to do action. I think that's his calling card, and he also seems to know how to write good funny jokes. Like everything he does is essentially an action comedy. And then the most recent one, Bullet Train. I mean, that was my favorite movie the year it came out. I was familiar with its source material, but not on this level. And so more or less, I went in completely surprised, and I just was absolutely blown away. I thought Bullet Train was amazing. I immediately started recommending it to everybody that hadn't seen it. Brad Pitt, of course, is awesome. All of the I'm sorry, I don't want to just say Brad Pitt. Aaron Taylor Johnson is great. All of the cast. Brian Tyree Henry is amazing. The whole thing with Thomas the Tank Engine. I didn't know that those jokes could make me laugh, and they do. So he just Uh, I think he is really good at doing action comedy. I think he writes well. And of course, being a stuntman coming off of John Wick, he knows how to do good action sequences. Kind of like I mentioned earlier, I'm a sucker for when they're long, drawn out. You can tell that the actors are doing their own stunts. I just respect it more. I think it looks better. I think it is more real. So it's you just can connect more. And so David Leitch is definitely, I guess you would call him an up and coming actor because he's done a couple, but of course he's been around for a decade and even longer if you consider how long he's been a stuntman. But he's definitely one of my favorites, and he sits at my number 4.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting looking at the different career paths. Like Chad Stahelski has just been doing John Wick movies for a decade, and David Leitch has done such a very like diverse range of films since. So it's just interesting to see that sort of like splintering off of their careers.
I'm of
Yeah,
course not 100% sure what happened because I wasn't in the room, but apparently Chad and David were like best friends and they essentially had a falling out over that first movie. I think it was like a money issue because it always is. And so David was like, "All right, fine. You do John Wick. I'm gonna go have fun killing Hollywood."
yeah, and I think David won between the two of them. Yeah, I mean, I love the first John Wick. That's still that and three were my favorite of the I haven't seen four yet, but that and three were
That's why you're
basically
saying
very
3.
close together. Yes, yeah, that and three were very close together. And then never saw Atomic Blonde. Still have to check that out. Um, Also never saw Hobbs and Shaw because I haven't seen the Fast and Furious franchise yet, but definitely will be coming one day. It's one of my franchises in 2024. I wanted to make a list of like franchises I needed to watch, and that's just something I'll squeeze in somewhere in 2024. Um, Deadpool 2, you're right. We're kind of opposite on that. I didn't really like Deadpool 2. I haven't to be completely honest, I haven't actually rewatched it since theaters, but when I first saw it in theaters, I just really didn't like it and didn't care for it. And none of it's really stuck to me as like memorable even. So I know before Deadpool 3, I'll definitely rewatch it, but I remember just really not liking Deadpool 2. And then Bullet Train, absolutely loved. It was in my top 5 of last year. It's just so funny, so high energy. The action's great. Oh, I love the casts and like the surprise cast members. Um, it was all just done so well. And yeah, the Fall Guy, I saw the trailer, didn't really hook me in, but sort of like what you said, I think David Leitch in general, at least for me with Bullet Train, has me at least intrigued that definitely might just have to check it out just because he's involved. And Ryan Gosling, he's kind of on a hot streak right now, and probably one of I wouldn't say he's one of my favorite actors right now, but I do genuinely like him as an actor, so that helps.
Yeah, I'm notoriously not a fan of Emily Blunt, but kind of like you said, the trailer doesn't really do much, but once you see David Leitch, you're in. And it looks like the movie he's doing after that is called Undying Love. I'm just gonna read this for you because I want you to get a good laugh. An ex-soldier falls for a vampire, though, in order to be with her, he must take on her creator, who is protected by an army of monsters in the Hong Kong underworld.
That is like a Mad Libs movie description.
I just thought that
It's
was
like
perfect.
three different genres just converging together.
So when that movie comes out, I will definitely have butt in seat. And just going off what you said for Bullet Train, I'm gonna spoil this just because I think it's cool. Um, the There is something to be said for the fact that a lot of these actors are friends with each other, or they work with a director and then they become buddies because then they can just pull them in like you were saying with the different cameos. So Sandra Bullock and Channing Tatum were doing their movie The Lost City, and they were like, "Hey Brad Pitt, you want to help us out with a cameo?" And then in return, he was like, "Hey guys, you want to help me out with a cameo?" So then Channing Tatum has one of the funniest parts in that movie. It is just, and he's in it for like 2 seconds, and it's hilarious. And then of course Sandra's in at the end. But that's one of the things that's like obviously when you're watching a movie it's about the universe, but it's kind of cool the behind the scenes stuff that can happen and the fact that they're all friends and can kind of just pull each other in on stuff, and that's how we get fun cameos like in Deadpool 2. Brad Pitt apparently wouldn't have even been on Leach's mind for Bullet Train if he wasn't friends with Ryan Reynolds. And Reynolds said, "Hey Pitt, can you come do a cameo?" Literally, like the day they were filming it, he just called up Pitt, and Pitt was like, "Sure, I'm not doing anything this morning." And then the rest is history. So that's just kind of like one of the cool behind the scenes things for movies where they're like they're buddies and they're just like, "Hey, come help me out," and then we get masterpieces.
For sure. Maybe Fall Guy will maybe that'll just be like his trademark. I could definitely dig that. Okay. So my number 3 is someone who I have mentioned before as thinking they're overrated, but like we've said before, overrated doesn't mean bad. It just means like the title or like the name suggests, overrated, that they're rated higher than they should be. This is still an amazing director, and he's made plenty of there's so much I respect about his directing style, and he's made plenty of films that I love. So for number 3, I'm going with Christopher Nolan. I just had to this list somewhere. I think as far as prolific directors working now, I think he's arguably the top, I think, on like if we were going with like an objective list. But even on a subjective list, he's another one of these creators who's very selective with his projects because he also likes to write movies that he directs. So he's very involved start to finish. Notoriously, he spends like 10 to 15 years crafting storylines for some of his movies like Tenet or Inception, for better or for worse, for movies like Tenet. But yeah, I just think you really can't have a discussion about favorite or best directors, in my opinion, without talking about Nolan because he just has such a solid filmography that's pretty consistent. Now, obviously, I have them ranked, and he's got some that are less desirable than others, but even his in my opinion least ranked film is still like a 3.5 out of 5. So I think as far as consistency, he's one of the most consistent directors that's working now, and I genuinely do love a lot of his films. Oppenheimer from this year. Is, and will be my favorite movie of the year. Saw it like 3 times in theaters. I plan on watching it a million more times on 4K. Everything I'd hoped and dreamed and more. And it is probably my favorite movie of the 2020s. Top Gun Maverick is very close, but I just absolutely loved Oppenheimer. And so that also contributed to putting him on this list. Now, as I mentioned, I've said that Nolan is overrated, and that's just because most people say he's like the greatest director of all time. Everything he puts out is perfect. He's the gold standard. And I don't quite think that. Like I said, he's a great director. He's at my number 3. He does a great job at directing. From a technical standpoint, I genuinely believe he is the most talented director working right now. When it comes to just someone who knows film, who knows how to direct, he is probably I'd put money on considering him the best director working right now. But yeah, I just think the overrated part comes in because he has this tendency, and you see it a lot more in his later films, I think, where he stresses ideas and concepts and themes because he's really into like philosophy and ethics and things like that, and like physics, science, philosophy intertwining, metaphysics, things such as he stresses ideas and themes and symbolism over characters and plot. I think we see this in stories like Tenet, especially, but also just things like the Dark Knight trilogy, as I've talked about my problems with how he interpreted Bruce Wayne as the character. You see that in The Dark Knight Rises, one of his messiest films, I would just structure wise. You start to see that in like Dunkirk and somewhat in Interstellar. You just start to see this trend where he starts to take over, like, okay, this story is going to have a lot of plot holes. The story might not make sense. These characters aren't going to be the best, but I'm talking about these really cool ideas. So, give or take. But I mean, in his filmography, I mean, Inception is my second favorite of his films. Love Inception. I think that's the perfect balance of Nolan, where he is bringing in the high concept, he is bringing in the big themes, the big ideas, but also has great character work in a story that actually does make sense. I think The Prestige is his most underrated film. It's an incredible movie that most people haven't even heard of, much less associate with Nolan, that people need to check out. Of course, his Dark Knight trilogy is great. Not much to say there. We talked about that before. He made this movie Insomnia in 2002 with Robin Williams and Al Pacino. Another really underrated one. It's like a true crime thriller that he directed that most people don't know about. Um, and then, yeah, I mean, Interstellar is great. Obviously, like I said, Oppenheimer is one of my favorite movies of the 2020s, if not my favorite movie of the 2020s, easily my favorite of this year. I think it's going to sweep at the Oscars, Best Picture. I think he'll finally get his Best Director Oscar. Um, so yeah, so just a director that I'm comfortable saying is overrated, but still comfortable putting in my top five by recognizing, sort of who he is and loving him for both his strengths and his flaws.
It is shocking to me that he has not won a Best Director yet. That almost feels like the whole conversation we had about when Leo finally got his Best Actor. Um, yeah, this one's interesting because, of course, familiar with all of his work. I would agree with your statement. I feel like after Oppenheimer, from what I can gather, he is just heralded as the king of all directors. So I agree with what you were saying about objectively, he's up there as one of the best. I also agree with what you're saying about how he's an amazing director, and you can also feel comfortable with saying that he's overrated. Um, the thing that's most interesting to me is so I absolutely love Memento. And for some reason, I feel like that's one of the ones that gets a lot of hate. And I guess it's because it's his first one. And so, you scrutinize your original. I have seen Insomnia. It's awesome. And I've seen The Prestige. It's great. From there, never saw Inception, never saw Interstellar, never saw Dunkirk, never saw Tenet. Oppenheimer's on the list. I'm just waiting for it to hit streaming. And so with the latter ones, like Inception, Interstellar, at least before Oppenheimer, those were the two that everybody said best movies ever made. You have to watch them if you can even remotely consider yourself a movie fan. Um, it just didn't. I don't know. Interstellar definitely did not interest me. Inception did. Tried watching with my dad. He gave up after 30 minutes, and then I just never went back to finish it. So that's partly on me. But so I can't really speak to those. And it's like it's interesting to me because his latter work is the stuff that's talked about so much, but yet I've seen the early stuff and I love it. And then, of course, as you know, I think that the Dark Knight trilogy, all 7.5 hours deserve to be watched in a row. You cannot watch them separately. I think that the entire Dark Knight trilogy as a movie, as a whole, is the best movie ever made. I know I'm a crazy person and nobody actually considers an entire trilogy together as one movie, but I cannot watch those movies without sitting down for 7.5 hours in a row and watching them. I just think they're so perfect back to back to back as if they weren't even three different movies. The Dark Knight trilogy is one movie. I know I'm crazy. But the one that always gets me is Memento. I don't get why people don't like that one's just awesome. So I just wanted to give that one a shout out. And so yeah, Christopher Nolan's very interesting to me because the stuff that everybody loves, I haven't seen or doesn't interest me. And then of course, Batman. You have two different Batman directors on your list.
Do
Oh my God,
and possibly
three
a third.
because Ben Affleck technically played Batman. So I now know that your top two directors are going to be George Clooney and Val Kilmer.
You got Adam West. No, there may or may not be a Batman related director coming up, but um, yeah. So Memento, I watched it for the first time.
Sorry, no, I won't spoil, but I now know who it is.
Um, yeah, I saw Memento for the first time this year because I watched all the Nolan movies to rank before Oppenheimer. Really loved Memento. He actually did have a movie before Memento called Following, but it's
Okay.
basically a student film. It's on the Criterion Collection. It's not like a wide release. It wasn't wide released. He literally made it like as like a student film and he basically filmed it with his friends like on weekends and it's like an hour and 10 minutes and so like it's very much a student film but it's still kind of like in the Nolan filmography people say so like I will just say I saw Following and Following it's okay but you can definitely see Nolan's like Nolanisms, even though he's like really young and it's like this really cheap film, like student film. You can still see his Nolanisms, so that's cool to see. But most people, if anything, don't know about Following. And I wouldn't necessarily see like you have to clamor out to see it, but I think if you like Nolan, it's at least worth seeing sort of like where he like actually started, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. Um,
So anyway, yes, yeah, number three, Christopher Nolan.
Also, are you sure Oppenheimer's gonna kill? What about Barbie? No, I'm just kidding. I just know that Barbenheimer was the big meme, and didn't they? Didn't wasn't the whole thing that Oppenheimer was the best-selling movie ever to never be number one in money or whatever because Barbie kept killing each weekend or something like that?
Yes, Oppenheimer is the highest grossing movie that was never number one at the box office.
There we go. That's the power of Barbie. Um, so my number three, so my top three, you could probably guess them if you were to give it a shot. You probably wouldn't get the order, but none of these will be surprises. The third one is essentially one of my favorite horror directors of all time, and it is Wes Craven, R.I.P. And I think we've talked about this before. John Carpenter, especially for the time period, is heralded as like the best thing to grace horror since sliced bread. And to me, I feel like that's just not true. I think that if you look at the filmography of Wes Craven, Craven, it's just better, objectively speaking, than Carpenter. I know we've talked about this before. I think Carpenter gets carried pretty heavily by Halloween and The Thing, which isn't
I
necessarily a bad
agree.
thing. Both those movies are really good, but um, as far as Wes Craven's concerned, Last House on the Left, Hills Have Eyes, Summer of Fear, Nightmare on Elm Street, People Under the Stairs, all the Scream movies. I personally really like Cursed up until I saw The Wolf Man a little bit ago. Cursed was one of my favorite, if not my favorite wolf movie. I still think there should be more werewolf movies. I think Curse is very underrated. And then the last movie he did before he died was called My Soul to Take, which absolutely bombed. However, I really liked it. I think he creates a very interesting, like, Ghostface-esque killer to try and like just, you know, have more fun with the ideas of that character without being in the Scream universe. And I know everybody didn't really like it, but I did. But yeah, when you really look at his entire filmography, I think that he explores very interesting themes. I think that he has a really interesting way of trying to figure out what, like, okay, let me see if I can explain this properly. So when he does a movie, he takes something that seems completely normal and then just creeps the crap out of you. And what I mean by that is, so Nightmare on Elm Street we've talked about. He said, "Where's the place that you're the safest when you're sleeping? It's supposed to be, you're in your bed, you're safe. Well, I'm going to create a person who is going to come after you when you sleep, and so you'll never be safe." With Last House on the Left, it's the story of you're going to a vacation home. You think about when you're on vacation, nothing bad ever happens on vacation, and then the worst thing that ever could possibly happen happens. I talked about this before when I was talking about the reboot. The idea of somebody does something to your kid, what would you do as a parent? Something that would be very real, but of course you hope you're never in that situation. Hills Have Eyes, even you were talking about with the reboot, the idea of just what could happen if you were in that situation. Something that could be very real, but of course it's not something you encounter every day. And you see that a lot with a lot of his movies. People Under the Stairs, which is even based on a real story. Of course, once you get to Scream once you get to Cursed, it's not like you're going to encounter a werewolf. But even that talks about the themes of having older siblings and what comes from dealing with that relationship and whatnot. Um, and then of course, leave it to Wes Craven. The slasher genre had died. I think I've talked about this before. There's this awesome documentary that goes through the rise and fall of the slasher, and in the late '90s, he completely re- brought it back with '96's Scream. It essentially revolutionized the genre. We get all of these Scream clones after it, and that was all Wes Craven. He perfectly crafts this movie that both simultaneously speaks to the themes in a good way of slasher movies, but also makes fun of them in a clever way, and also crafting a legitimately good horror movie. There's good scares. I think that a lot of people would agree that the villains are done very well. The general themes are awesome. And so he just has all of those things in his movies that are just really well done. And I think this is a theme between both of our lists. When the directors are also writers and they're able to fully put their time and effort into creating their masterpieces, creating their babies, so to speak, it just shows. And I think that that is especially true with Wes Craven. So, yeah, my number three is who I personally believe is one of the best horror directors and is better than John Carpenter, Wes Craven.
Yeah, by and large, I agree. I've reflected how I'm not particularly a huge fan of John Carpenter's style. Notable exceptions being Halloween and The Thing. And I do think ugh, generally, I am a but much bigger fan of Wes Craven, movie for movie. Um, yeah, I mean, like you said, Nightmare on Elm Street, absolutely iconic. One of my favorite '80s horror movies. Created one of my favorite horror characters, Freddy Krueger. Scream, huge fan, especially that first quartet that he was actually directing.
Yep.
Just incredible standouts in the genre, like you said, helped revolutionize and revitalize the genre. You mentioned The People Under the Stairs, definitely one of the most underrated Craven and I think just one of the most underrated. Like I know it came out in '91, but it has like a very '80s feel. So
Yeah.
like that era, one of the most underrated movies, and one that apparently is getting a reboot with Jordan Peele. So I think he's one of the perfect people that would be able to tackle that because it deals with like social issues and a lot of things that he's very concerned about.
Yeah.
Um, and then I will just say, quick plug, The Serpent and the Rainbow. I don't know if you've seen that.
Mm-mm.
That is probably, I'd say, along with People Under the Stairs, his most underrated movie. A lot of people haven't seen it. It's really good. It deals with like Haitian voodoo and stuff. It is just, it's great. So yeah, Serpent and the Rainbow would be like my go-to recommendation for people who like Wes Craven because it's one of his like lost films that like most people don't remember.
And see, it's interesting. Have you seen Summer of Fear?
I have not.
Okay, because I felt like that one was gonna be my like under the radar one, but then of course I haven't seen Serpent and the Rainbow. Summer of Fear was a TV movie that essentially was like his take on witchcraft, and it stars Linda Blair, who was coming off of Exorcist. So it just like happened to exist, and it's really good. But since it's a TV movie, you can't find it anywhere.
Yeah, Serpent and the Rainbows with Bill Pullman, and it's based on a true story roughly about this guy who travels to Haiti to investigate this like substance that apparently can like basically like make zombies, like bring people back from the dead, like traditional voodoo zombies. And so it just deals with like voodoo magic and like black magic and stuff like that in Haiti. It's really good and like really freaky.
Well, hey, the only movie of Wes Craven's that I haven't liked was Vampire in Brooklyn, so I think the odds are pretty good that I'll like that movie, so I'll definitely give it a shot.
So, okay. My number two, as I have alluded before, of somewhat of a Batman director. I'm making four on my list, and I definitely would get so much hate for this having him above Christopher Nolan, but have to rip the band-aid off. My number two is Zack Snyder. Um, Zack Snyder is one of those directors that I feel like I constantly have to defend from every angle. Even my Twitter handle says that I'm a Zack Snyder shill, just because that's been pointed out very frequently. Um, yeah, what can I say? I mean, I just absolutely love the man and his work. Obviously, as I said before, with I think defending bad movies, Batman v Superman is probably my favorite comic book movie, if not like up there in like the top two or three. And it's all just because of him. And I just wish we could have seen the universe, the Snyderverse, as he properly intended. But I just think across his whole filmography, he is such a. I talked about this with Lee Winnell. Zack Snyder is a very strong visual director. For a lot of his movies, especially the way he does action sequences with his iconic slow mo, I just think he makes every frame a painting. Just the way scenes look, the way action scenes play out, and the way he times his slow mo that he's so known for. It just makes for just an absolute portrait and painting on the screen. Um, and I think you see this especially in 300 as well. which the way the slow-mo in 300, it looks like a comic book come to life because it's based on a graphic novel. But I think he really brought that flair to make it look like a comic book come to life. I think he did the same thing with Watchmen. I'm a huge fan of Watchmen. I love the graphic novel and the movie. It's one of those things where Alan Moore is really weird, and Alan Moore is like, oh, I automatically hate any movie adaptation of my work. But I feel like Zack Snyder did like such a great job at adapting it that like he wouldn't be mad, but he has to pretend to be mad because that's his edgy personality. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Um, yeah, Watchmen 2, it just looks like the comics come to life because he's got such that strong visual flair. Yeah, 300's action sequences are incredible. The way the abs glisten, I mean, it's chef's kiss. It's impeccable. Um, and then when it comes to his Snyderverse, I've made it no secret. I love Man of Steel. I absolutely love BVS, and I love the Snyder Cut. His vision for the Snyderverse, I just wish we could have seen. I think what he did so well with that and what he's alluded to in his other films is he does a great job of giving things like weight and giving things like a gravity to them about, you know, the way he tackled these characters in his Snyderverse films, not just deconstructing them, but he sort of made them these like mythological. He took the idea of superheroes and he weighted it to be that they're like the gods of ancient times, like they're these mythic heroes, and he really contextualizes that in his universe. And I think he does that in a lot of his films, like in Watchmen, in 300, in Man of Steel, BVS, all this. Like he brings this certain weight to the stories he tells, where they're like mythological allegories, gods amongst men. He just makes things so epic. And I feel like it's sort of like I don't want to say like it's sort of like how Michael Bay makes epic movies, but I would say in like a more serious, self-serious way, not in like a Michael Bay just having fun with explosions way, but like he still makes these like epic scales of like big battles, big consequences, big ideas, while still also being concerned about individuals. Like you think about a movie like BVS, which I've already ranted on so many times, but just a film like BVS where like it deals with these big heavy themes like gods amongst men, what, existentially, what does Superman mean for the world? And it's really an ideological battle. When you really look at the movie, it's not that big scale. Until the very end, there's not like this giant world ending consequence where the universe is going to implode. It's really just a clash of ideologies. Even something like 300 where it's about a big battle, it still feels very much like the characters. And so I feel like he does this great job, like I said, of just taking this massive weighty scope, making these things that are truly epic, but not forgetting his main characters because he mythologizes them and makes them like these ancient heroes. So huge fan of all of his filmography. I'm very excited for Rebel Moon. That's probably actually that is my most anticipated for the rest of the year. Not that there's much left, but very excited for Rebel Moon coming to Netflix this December. So yeah, huge hot take and upset, but Zack Snyder. That my number two.
So, by the logic of your list, that means that number one is either Tim Burton or Joel Schumacher. um, yeah, I know it's a hot take given recent events, but I would agree generally with your Zack Snyder takes. I've liked everything that he's done, and I think I said this when we last talked about BVS. I think that's just one of the biggest travesties that we never got a chance to have Zack Snyder fully make his universe with the DC products, and that's going to be one of the big what ifs that I'll think about 20 years from now. I was a little let down by Army of the Dead. I was very excited for that one, but I am also very excited for Rebel Moon, so hopefully that one's much better than Army of the Dead. I don't know if you liked Army of the Dead or not.
Army of the Dead was lower on my list for him. I still liked it a good bit, but I would say it's not one of my favorites.
Okay. Well, yeah, no, solid choice. I definitely feel like the DCEU endeavor kind of ruined a lot of people on him as opposed to his earlier work, but he's still a good person who's going to keep making movies, so of course he'll always have a chance to get back in people's good graces, and maybe you won't have to have a hot take anymore.
Hopefully one day.
So, my number two is who I personally feel like is my favorite horror director. I'm sure you could guess who this is. It is none other than Eli Roth. Of course, Thanksgiving. I'm going to see it on Sunday. Very excited, and he's directing the Borderlands movie. Love those games, so excited for that. But going off of his earlier stuff, Cabin Fever, Green Inferno, Hostel, Knock Knock. House of the Clock and Its Walls was, of course, his venture into kids horror, but I still think he did a great job. Death Wish was his venture into action. I think that one's solid. And then I don't know if people like Shark Week, but he did a documentary for them called Finn, which, if you count that, I liked it, but it's not like it was him showing off like his greatest directing like he does it in other movies. So take that as you will, but I did put it on my list. But one of the things I love about Eli Roth is kind of what I said about Wes Craven, but Eli Roth takes it to a whole nother level. He loves doing social commentary, but against social commentary. And what I mean by that is the idea for Green Inferno came from him wanting to make fun of social justice warriors. You have those people who are like, oh, there are these people who are having, poor, like something's going wrong, and they're talking about how everybody else should do something to help them out, and that they would if they could, but then they never actually do anything about it, or that they have empty words, we'll say. And so he decides, all right, let's explore that a little bit more. And of course, it ends up going terribly. With Hostel, it's the idea of the people overseas and they're having fun in hostels, and then it goes terribly wrong. With Knock Knock, it's the idea of this quote unquote perfect man who would never cheat on his family, and then they kind of do the whole idea of, did he really cheat? Did he not cheat? Does it then justify their actions after the actual event? He really likes to play with these philosophical ideas and sort of, in my personal opinion, in the movies, he does a great job of making everybody terrible, so you don't really know who to root for, and it almost makes you have to look inside yourself to really figure out which side you agree with, which at least for me is very fun. And so I've always loved the way he's played with those social ideas. He himself is also just a very cool person. I would love to meet the guy. He was one of my idols growing up. When I first started writing my own scripts, they were heavily inspired by Eli Roth. I was trying to do the same thing he did, where I'd think about things that were common in the social world and see how I could twist them to be kind of like him. And so he definitely has a special place in my heart. Of course, now he's back to doing horror with Thanksgiving, which is cool. He had kind of stepped away from horror to explore other things, which is perfectly fine. He has been doing a bunch of shows on TV that kind of dive into the history of horror, so those have been really cool. But yeah, me being a horror fan, he's personally my favorite director for that reason. I love the idea of the exploration. I think he does philosophy in a good way, and everything is so wonderfully creepy. Like, I don't really get scared at movies that I watch. I don't really get creeped out, but in all of his movies, it's like, I don't want to say so bad it's good, but the entire time you're just like, ew, but you can't stop watching. Like, there's literally a scene in Green Inferno where the young kid from Spy Kids, I forget his name, he decides he wants to play a joke with the cannibals, so he stuffs a body with weed, not thinking that the cannibals were then going to get the munchies. So then they eat him all because they had the munchies. And it's those things that's like so sick and twisted, but it's also hilarious, and it can only come from the mind of Eli Roth, and I love it. So my number two is Eli Roth.
No, a really good pick. I'm a big fan of Eli Roth as well. I haven't seen Cabin Fever in a while, but I definitely want to rewatch that because I remember really liking it when I first watched it. I remember the body horror being really grody, so I definitely need to check that out again. Yeah, exactly like you said, he excels at making you feel uncomfortable. Like maybe not necessarily scared, but like uncomfortable. But like you said, it's like
Definitely.
that weird balance of like you kind of just have to watch. Yeah, big fan of Hostel. Hostel Part 2 is all right. I haven't rewatched that one in a while. Maybe I might warrant a rewatch. I do really like Green Inferno. Knock Knock. Ugh. Knock Knock is like I don't even know where to begin with Knock Knock. I can't say much. I just Knock Knock is one of those movies that I feel like stuck with me for the longest time. I think
Oh,
when it can
100%.
when it comes to being uncomfortable and when it comes to like disturbing, I think Knock Knock is probably the most disturbing movie I've seen. Just like it just goes to no end and it doesn't stop. Like he doesn't let up. It just becomes increasingly more uncomfortable.
And the best part is, so Keanu Reeves had gone through his stardom, and he was at the point at this time where he was kind of just doing indie flicks, like he was in the actor renaissance. No one knew John Wick was going to pick up. And so he did Knock Knock directly after John Wick, and this almost counted as like, I don't want to say indie because of course it did go out in theaters, and it had people attached like Eli Roth, but at the same time this wasn't like a big action blockbuster like Keanu's back to doing now. And so it's really cool that they managed to get Keanu, because I think he adds an extra layer to the movie just because he's generally speaking a good actor. But yeah, I would 100% agree. I would rather watch Hostel and Green Inferno again than Knock Knock, which is saying something, because in my personal opinion, Hostel 2 has one of the worst kills I have ever seen in a movie, and I literally can't watch it.
Yeah, Knock Knock was my introduction to Ana de Armas as well. So this was like one
Okay.
of her breakthrough roles. Actually, fun fact, she didn't know how to speak English when she filmed it, and so she did all of her lines phonetically.
Okay. That's cool. I
This
knew
was
that it
like, I
was her
think,
breakthrough, but I didn't know that second part.
right, yeah, it was like her first American movie. What a introduction to American cinema. Um, yeah, I've never seen Death Wish. I haven't seen The House with a Clock in Its Walls. I'm actually seeing Thanksgiving tomorrow. I'm very excited. I've heard nothing but great things. So, looking forward to that.
Yeah,
But
once I
also
saw the trailer, I was hooked.
he's also just a great producer. Like I'm looking at his producing. I mean, The Last Exorcism, a movie I talked about, one of my favorite possession movies. Clown is really good. Haunt
Mhm.
is another really good one. He also co-produced Baywatch, which is interesting, but I like the Baywatch remake. So there you go.
Yeah, he's essentially kind of like I alluded to. He did House on the Clock with its walls in 2018, and then kind of just stopped directing and started just producing a bunch of stuff. And if you see all of those Eli Roth presents, they are all really good. Wholeheartedly recommend watching, especially if you're a horror fan, especially the history of horror. There's a lot of really cool things because of his stature, I guess we'll say. He's able to get interviews with a lot of horror legends to be able to kind of go behind the scenes, and it's almost like a tell-all. So if you're somebody who really likes looking into those kinds of things, then I highly recommend them.
So my number one. This is the director I feel like I'm always quoting when people are like, "Oh, Nolan's the best director, Nolan's whatever." I feel like this is the director I'm always comparing to Nolan, saying that I actually prefer him and his films better. So my number one is David Fincher. David Fincher, obviously he's my number one, so I'm very confident in saying that he's my favorite working director right now. And like I said, he's sort of my common response to people saying that Nolan is the best, is their favorite. I know I said Nolan was maybe technically the best. I think Fincher is very, very close to second. Or he is second, very close to Nolan, right on his butt. But yeah, I just think David Fincher has, when it comes to just movies he's made, some of my favorite movies of all time. Gone Girl is one of my favorite movies of all time. The Social Network is one of my favorite movies of all time. Zodiac is one of my favorite movies of all time. Those are all 5 out of 5 movies. So like right off the bat, three 5 out of 5 movies for me, which I don't give out 5 out of 5s that often. So yeah, his entire filmography, it just resonates with my genres, like how you talked about with Guy Ritchie making crime movies, sort of, which is your thing. I love psychological thrillers. I love true crime. I just like thrillers in general, and that's like David Fincher's bread and butter, and he just excels in that genre. And He is really good at adaptation because one of his sort of trademarks, he doesn't write really. I think he might have written like one or two of his scripts, but he typically doesn't write. He gets scripts and he brings them to life, or he adapts books like he did with Gone Girl, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Even Zodiac is based on the book of the real guy who was chronicling what happened. And notoriously, with like Gone Girl, in one of the interviews, he was like, "Yeah, I read it like 27 times before I even like started directing it." And I think having read a lot of the books that he's adapted, it really shows. He excels at taking written material and really bringing it to life the way that you envision it in your head. Like I know for Gone Girl and The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, having read the books, he does just such a great job of bringing it to life. And that's one of the things that I love about him, on top of just, reigning in a genre that is my favorite. So yeah, I mean, Seven, one of the best true crime thrillers of all time. The Game with Michael Douglas, I think, is his definitely his most underrated film. That one's quite good. Fight Club out, I'm actually hot take, not too crazy on, but like Panic Room is really underrated. Zodiac, I said, is my favorite of all time. Not too hot about Curious Case of Benjamin Button. Social Network, one of my favorite movies of all time. Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, really great adaptation, really good, gritty noir, psychological, true crime thriller. Gone Girl, like I said, one of my favorite movies of all time. Mank, kind of a dud, not really his main thing. He kind of probably should have stuck to what he's good at. And then I have not seen The Killer yet. That just dropped this week, but I plan on watching that this weekend, and I'm very excited for that. And I couldn't also just limit it to movies. He's also involved in TV. He was an executive producer on House of Cards, which is my favorite TV show of all time, and he directed several of the episodes. And he also was an executive producer on Mindhunter, which he's most famous for, and that is also one of my favorite TV shows. And he directed a lot of the episodes. He was a lot more involved with Mindhunter, but right up my alley with the true crime stuff. Like I said, his bread and butter. And so can't just limit it to his movies, have to include his TV. So even his TV shows are um, some of my favorite TV shows of all time. So number one for me is David Fincher.
I did not know this, but it turns out his actual bread and butter is directing music videos. Jesus Christ.
Yep,
Before
that was
getting
his that was his start.
into this is awesome. Because I saw it says directing 95 movies. So I was like, oh my God, I didn't know he did that many. And as I'm scrolling, it's just all music videos. So that's cool. I always love when they kind of do the hop. So that is cool. But yeah, this one's an interesting one. Like you said, we talked about Fight Club, so I won't necessarily go into that, but I absolutely love Seven. That one's one of my favorites of like the classic movies. Uh, Other than that, though, I've never necessarily been a Fincher person. I think you famously remember hating me when I said I didn't like The Social Network. I haven't seen Zodiac. I've heard that one's good. I did like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And that's about it. I didn't like Gone Girl, which I know you hate because that's one of your favorites. I never saw Mank. But yeah, this one's kind of one where like I always know Fincher exists. He's on everybody's list for like best directors of the modern era. And I just yeah, that I don't know. It's all on me for having not really seen a lot of his stuff. I feel like I've seen the major ones at least, but the only one I really like is Seven. So I don't know. I can't necessarily comment on this one, but I should have been able to guess that he would be your number one. But going into this, I assumed it'd be either Reeves or Snyder, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, and even calling back to the Batman, I mean, when you look at Matt Reeves's, then it's literally what if Batman but Seven, or what if Batman but Zodiac.
Yes.
Even Reeves himself was very open that he got a lot of inspiration from David Fincher, especially with Seven and Zodiac, because, like I said, Fincher is like the king of like true crime and psychological thrillers. So Matt Reeves was very vocal about how Fincher's work inspired sort of his take on Batman. So I also somewhat credit him for that as well.
Okay. Yeah. No. That's so. There you go. All five of your people are related to Batman in some way. So I think that's saying something.
All Lee Winnell just needs to make a Batman movie. Bring on Lee Winnell for Brave and the Bold. Fire Andy Muschietti and put in Lee Winnell.
To be fair, and I promise I won't go on too big of a tangent, I personally feel like there's a lot of really good Batman horror related IPs that should be adapted, but they'll never touch because that's just not how Batman is, or at least I don't think that that's how they want to portray him to the public eye. But if Lee Winnell ever got his hand like on the famous Arkham Asylum comic, I think that that would be awesome. Just as a random aside.
Really, also really random aside, just real quick, wanted to put this out there because I just thought of it. Give Lee Winnell Blade.
I
I'll just say that and then drop the mic.
We will be asking that question until this podcast ends because it'll be will Blade ever come out?
Yeah, but I mean,
Um
I really think Lee Winnell as Blade. Just give him that. That's all I'll say.
yeah, no, that actually that one's not bad. It'd be better than all the stuff they've had. Um So for my number one, you probably could have guessed this one. This is my favorite director of all time, and it's not just because of the movies he makes, it's also because of who he is as a person. When I talked about kind of being inspired by Eli Roth, my entire movie making style is due to this guy. He revolutionized an entire way of filming, and I have completely eaten it up. I've read his book and all of that jazz. And it is number one, Robert Rodriguez. Um, for those of you who don't know, he created a movie called El Mariachi in 1992. This was his passion project. And when I say that he revolutionized a way of filming, he is a complete one man show. Now, of course, later on, he would get funding and he would make bigger things. But his whole idea is that you should be able to do every single part of the movie, so that way there's nothing stopping you. And if let me see if I can remember the quote. The most creative people have the least amount of money because there are a lot of people who there's an issue during production and they just throw money at it. And his thing is, I'm not going to throw money at it. I'm just going to find a creative way around the problem. And I think it just works amazingly. And so this is partly because I respect the guy wholeheartedly. That's why he's number one. But also, he has done a bunch of movies that I like. So, um, going off of the with El Mariachi, he did a full trilogy. Not necessarily my favorite. I do really like Desperado. I get the hype. From Dusk Till Dawn is probably one of his favorites. The Faculty, which is a really underrated horror movie. Of course, as a kid, you got the Spy Kids trilogy. I didn't like either of the two reboots, but I'm not a kid, so I don't necessarily hold that against him. But I love the Spy Kids stuff. I love Planet Terror. Um, this one's gonna be a complete hot take. Machete and Machete Kills are epic. these totally fit the Jacob style of so cheesy, so campy, but so amazing that they're just fun. They're basically making fun of action movies the entire time, and it's just great if you're a big action fan. I'm still waiting for Machete Kills in Space. The third movie's been in development hell for ages. Um, then he did the Frank Miller Sin City. This one's one of my favorite movies. Was one of my favorite movies when I was a child. I absolutely love his adaptation. I love the way that he's able to essentially, not that noir isn't still appreciated, but of course it's very classic, and a lot of people don't like watching stuff in black and white, but he does a great neo noir. It's really good. I highly recommend it for people who kind of want to get into it. The other one I have on here is Alita Battle Angel. This was a manga that was adapted that I feel like a lot of people didn't give a fair shake. If I'm not mistaken, excuse me, they are still debating making sequels, but they've been in development hell for a while. I hope it gets sequels because the world's really, really fruitful. But as far as I know, nothing's really been made with that, and so that one's kind of sad. But that's just kind of hitting the topical pieces. Ironically, his newest movie is Hypnotic, starring Ben Affleck. So that one's the one that I have on my list. But yeah, just overall, this is another one that I'm just now realizing really like a lot of his early stuff and haven't seen a lot of the newest stuff. But to be fair, I'm looking at it, he just kind of keeps doing kids movies, so it's not like that's going to be something I'm necessarily going to flock to, so I'm not going to fault him for that. But yeah, the speaking on the ones from early on, and also like I said, this one purely comes down to me just idolizing him as a filmmaker. I love his style, and I love the fact that, like I said, creativity drives what he does. Creativity drives what he's able to do, and that just has completely resonated with me. He's defined everything I am as a filmmaker, and so I kind of feel like I have to put him at number one, even if it's not like some of the ones I had lower, where I love every movie that they've made, or he doesn't necessarily do any one thing that puts him above somebody else. I think he just knows how to make good, fun movies. And the fact that, especially in the early days, he did everything himself. Like, just think about that. When you see the credits roll from a movie, and there's hundreds of people who are doing things, in the early days before he hit big, he did all of them. So just a huge shout out to Robert Rodriguez. If you haven't read his book, I highly recommend it, especially if you're super into filmmaking as a whole. His whole thing is that you don't have to go to film school to be a filmmaker, and that you can learn, you learn better on the fly. You learn better when you're actually doing things as opposed to being in a classroom. There's so many great things that you can learn from that book. He's a great teacher. If I'm not mistaken, he literally says that that book is designed to make sure you don't waste money on film school. So it's just he's a cool guy. I'm ironically, I think I've said in the past how I'm not a big fan of Quentin Tarantino, yet he is a big inspiration for both Robert Rodriguez and Eli Roth, who are my top two favorite directors. They both are best friends with Quentin, and they both have openly said that they've been inspired by him, and they make a lot of movies because of him. And so it's ironic that I'm not a Tarantino fan, but my top two directors are direct, like, spawns from him. So that's very funny that I'm just now realizing. But yeah, number one is Robert Rodriguez.
Yeah, I looked at his filmography, and believe it or not, I've literally only seen this original Spy Kids trilogy. I have not seen any of his other films. Sin City's been a movie I've wanted to watch for a long time. The Faculty is one I've been wanting to watch for a long time. From Dusk Till Dawn is one I've been wanting to watch for a long time. But yeah, a lot of these I'd like heard of, hadn't necessarily had much interest, but I did do a little bit of research while you were talking. And apparently El Mariachi has the Guinness World Record for being the lowest budgeted film to ever gross over $1 million at the box office.
Yep. It was an absolute, it was, it's kind of like the Kevin Smith Clerk story, where they were two dudes with a dream and a camera, and they were filmed on, like, I want to say Kevin Smith's budget for Clerks was like $20, and that, I'm not exact sure on what the budget was for Mariachi, but Kevin Smith's on this list. But I'm just kind of bringing him up as like the same kind of, just a man with a dream, and it just happened to work out. Wasn't Paranormal Activity only filmed on like $1,000 or something?
It was a little bit higher. It was like 15 or 20,000.
Okay. Okay. So not, but yeah, El Mariachi it's interesting because it's one of those movies that I would almost say was like what you were talking about with Nolan's Following. Like, it has Robert Rodriguez written all over it, but it's definitely one that you kind of have to get through. And then Desperado's great.
Yeah, From Dusk Till Dawn and The Faculty are the two top ones I'd say that. Oh, I've seen Shark Boy and Lava Girl. Okay, I've
Yeah.
seen three. I've seen four, I guess, because I've saw
All
the
the
Spy Kids
ones
trilogy. But
related
yeah,
to Spy Kids you've seen.
yes, pretty much. So
I
yeah,
would
no,
be
I also want to check out his book too. I do want to check out his book.
I would be willing to bet that Sin City would probably be the one that you would like the most, knowing the type of movies that you like. In my personal opinion, it's very much similar to Watchmen, which is, they're both adapted from graphic novels, so that could be why. But I kind of always felt like they were the same kind of movie, at least. Uh, Grindhouse, and then Planet Terror, of course. If you don't know, a bunch of famous directors at that time got together to pay homage to the Grindhouse films of the 60s and 70s. And so his section's called Planet Terror. In my opinion, that's the best section of the Grindhouse. Grindhouse is like one of those, everybody either loves it or hate it. It's very divisive. And but I'm saying this because I feel like as a horror person you may enjoy it. It's Tarantino's the one who orchestrated it. It's got his name all on it. Eli Roth was involved. You'd recognize a bunch of the other directors. It's almost like an anthology film, but the overarching narrative is that it's designed to be like a grindhouse film. Is the best way I can put it.
Yeah. All right. Top 5 favorite directors.
Yeah. Oh, and one more thing I should say. His book has been made free because, like I said, he doesn't want you to have to pay for film school. So to like stay with his theme, he ended up making his book free. There's like a free you can download it straight from his website if anybody wants to read it.
Yeah, I'll definitely have to check that out then.